I rise in support of Senate Bill 341. This bill would modernize and streamline Pennsylvania's regulations that apply to our landline telephone companies. As this chamber works to close the digital divide, this is a critical tool that is much needed by landline telephone companies. Many of the regulations that exist in our public utility code have been in place for decades. However, we have seen sweeping changes to the technology and communications landscape, making these costly requirements unnecessary. This bill would permanently waive regulations from 52 PA Code Chapter 53, Sections 53.57 to 60, which are tariff filing requirements for incumbent local exchange carriers. Section 53.85 that regulates paper billing fees, and all of Chapter 63 and 64, which deal with telephone standards of billing practices for telephone services. Please know that the Commission would retain oversight as it pertains to customer complaints, 911, relay service, slamming and cramming, and universal service. The Commission would also be required to review its telecommunications regulations every 3 years and eliminate all regulations that are no longer necessary or in the public interest. Pennsylvania's landline telephone companies now represent less than 10% of voice subscriptions in the state and are subject to a strict regulatory framework based on outdated technology no longer being used by the majority of Pennsylvanians. And let me be crystal clear, Senate Bill 341 is not full deregulation. The obligations to provide voice service, rate regulation, and other quality of service metrics are all accounted for within the bill. I respectfully request an affirmative vote. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I'd like to address some of the concerns raised by the gentleman from Delaware County, particularly with regard to consumer protections. It should be noted that current regulations allow for a convoluted and confusing process whereby a customer can file a complaint with the Pennsylvania Public Utility Commission without ever having spoken with their provider. Pennsylvania's traditional landline telcos have experienced customers who are confused with billing and termination regulations currently in effect, and often it's difficult for the customer to know where they stand with regard to their service, and this uncertainty leads to additional and unnecessary complaints. Senate Bill 341 establishes a process whereby a customer contacting the PUC is immediately directed to their provider, who then has 30 days to resolve the customer's issue. In a highly competitive marketplace where traditional landline providers serve less than 10% of the voice subscriptions in Pennsylvania, the incentive to keep customers satisfied is at an all-time high. While current regulations provide for a confrontational and litigious framework to address customer complaints, Senate Bill 341 requires the Commission to offer mediation as an alternative to resolve a complaint if the company and the customer cannot work out a solution. If mediation does not work for the customer, there is nothing in this legislation that prohibits the customer from filing a complaint with the Commission, an option which does not exist currently for the customers who have voluntarily chosen to subscribe to services from a competing telecommunications provider. And it should be noted that we worked with stakeholders to improve the consumer protection provisions in this version of the legislation this session. And with regard to modernized telecom regulations and the timelines with which the PUC has been working under, the modernizing of Pennsylvania's telecom regulations was actually proposed by the PUC in 2015. 3 years later, in 2018, the PUC opened an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, which did not propose any specific regulatory changes, but rather sought input from interested parties. The Commission specifically stated at that time that it would advance a formal notice of proposed rulemaking upon consideration of the comments filed. In February of 2020, the PUC again solicited comments on the matter. And now in April in 2020, it has been over 5 years since they began consideration of this rulemaking. I think that the time is now for the General Assembly to lead and pass this legislation to assure that the regulations and the rules regarding outdated telephone regulations are modernized to assist all Pennsylvanians and help close the digital divide. Thank you, Mr. President.